afternoon and welcome to Vote Chat. My name is Nicole Taber and I will be your host and interview for today's show. As always with the 2014 Vote Chat series, we're coming at you live from the University of Otago's media production studio. Well, we're 1 month away from the election and things are heating up. Policy has taken a backseat this week with the release of emails relating to a book that seeks to reveal the darker side of our Prime Minister. One party hoping to stay on the clean side of politics is the Green Party, and today we'll be chatting with Green MP Kevin Hague. But first, this is Vote Chat, and in true Vote Chat style, we will be taking your questions through Twitter. Sam Hughes is covering the Twitter desk today, and here he is to tell us a little about that.
Thanks, Nicole. Today, as usual, we'll be accepting questions for our guest via social media. Today we are joined by Kevin Hague, who is an MP for the Greens. If you have any questions for Kevin or the Greens, you can tweet them to us via our Twitter handle @OUVoteChat. Alternatively, you can use the hashtag VoteChat14. But for now, back to Nicole.
Thanks, Sam. We look forward to receiving your questions, so do get them through. Now, though, I'd like to introduce you to our guest today. He's third on the Green Party list, a spokesperson for a range of issues and a current MP. Welcome to the show, Kevin Hague.
Hi, great to be here.
So, you've said before that you didn't consider going into politics as an MP until the Green Party came along. So what was it that attracted you to the Green Party that you perhaps didn't see in other parties at the time?
Well, for me, the Green Party has always had the right mix of social justice and environmental policies. And, you know, that's been my motivation for a long time. So it had so many values in common with my own. I couldn't see any values that weren't in common with my own. So it was the logical choice for me. So I supported the Green Party, you know, for as soon as I was able to. And when the time was right for me, decided that I should give it a go in terms of national politics.
And so before you joined the Green Party, you were quite heavily involved in some activism. So we had the Springbok tour, you were involved there. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, for me, I've always been sort of motivated to, if I see something that I think is wrong, it's actually very hard for me to not take action about that. So, so ever since I was, I guess, at school, you know, I've actually been motivated to take action about issues that I think need action taken on. So I was at university in the late 70s and early 80s, and so in 1980 I was involved in trying to stop the invitation to the Springboks to coming from New Zealand. Because people might need reminding nowadays that in those days South Africa was a sort of deeply racially divided country with apartheid laws that entrenched racism essentially, and the country was a global pariah, and here was New Zealand inviting, you know, a representative sports team in defiance of an international sports boycott of South Africa. So it seemed clear that we had to do something about that. So I got very heavily involved. So I was in the protest that people have seen. I'm in the film Patu, if people have seen the film Patu, as a fresh-faced young student. But I was a marshal in front lines, and after about the first couple of weeks of the tour, I'd become harder to spot because I'm wearing motorbike helmets, and then in the latter weeks of the tour, a hockey mask underneath, you know, a helmet. So I can spot me, but no one else can.
Right. And so what role do you feel that activism plays in politics? Because it seems that these days it's not head out to the streets, is it? It's not in the same way.
Yeah, I don't know about that. So I very much, I mean, when I look around my caucus colleagues in the Green Party caucus, I see people mostly who have been involved in kind of grassroots activism outside of Parliament and are now pursuing the same issues inside Parliament, so pursuing them in a different way. And certainly, kind of the issues that I've been involved with over the years outside Parliament through activism, actually I'm now in a position to do probably more about those things as a decision maker, and certainly from the opposition benches at the moment. But after September the 20th, it'll be from the government benches, and we'll be in a position to implement some of those policies that activists have been lobbying for. I guess, one thing looking back at 1981 that seems unbelievable to people, and people do look at Patu or sort of historical footage of those demonstrations, it will seem amazing just the extremely widespread level of intense and committed activism from New Zealanders, because mostly things don't look really like that nowadays. But if I think back to the last demonstration in 1980, which was after the rugby union had invited the Springboks, and so we were demonstrating at a rugby union meeting, I think there were probably 20 people on that demonstration, and then 6 months later we had 200,000 people in the streets. So it's possible to mobilise New Zealanders. Perhaps we're a bit slow to rouse, but actually if New Zealanders become convinced about the rightness of a cause, actually they are prepared to actually pursue that. And I thought we saw a little bit of that with the Schedule 4 mining issue back in 2009-10, when the national government proposed opening up some of our most precious conservation land for mining activity, and New Zealanders actually hit the streets, in very large numbers, saying absolutely not. These places are too precious to compromise on.
And perhaps another area where we're seeing some activism is in the case of 1080, which affects the people of your own electorate. We're seeing quite a bit of activism coming through there. What's your stance on using 1080 for pest control?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say, I don't think it's at the same kind of level of sort of public activism as the Schedule 4 mining issue, and certainly not the Springbok tour. But Green Party has a position of, 1080 is an agent we would much rather not be using. It kills animals in a cruel way. It kills animals that are not the target. So we have, over the past 6 years, been working actually with the government a bit to try to develop alternatives. So we published a policy that showed how you could subsidise the fur industry to actually reduce possum numbers to an ecologically sustainable level, so actually reduce them to the level needed for pest control. Unfortunately, government didn't adopt that policy. Here we are in Dunedin today, and at Invermay, there had been a group of scientists working on alternative methods of pest control, and actually had been making really good progress. So they had developed some agents that would work and be specific to killing marsupials. So, which is very promising, a much better alternative to 1080. But again, government's killed that program. The one area where government has worked with us on is on resetting traps. And what these do is they'll kill an animal, lure the possum or the rat or the stoat into the trap, kill it, and then reset with a small carbon dioxide cylinder. And they'll go off a number of times before they have to be checked and sort of re-provisioned. What that means is front country areas, so the areas that you can control pests on foot, using ground-based methods, could become sort of much more extensive, because you can afford to do ground-based control in places that you're only going to get into every 4, 5, 6 months rather than every couple of weeks. So that's a really positive and promising development. We're not quite at the end of the trials of that. But I guess what I'm saying is, what I'm pointing out is that the Green Party has said, okay, 1080 is not ideal, but we are a practical party that has a whole lot of ideas. Let's actually see what we can advance in terms of practical alternatives to 1080. Now, if we're able to do all of those things, it's still probable that there will be areas that we can't control with any of those methods. And actually, in that case, 1080 at this stage remains our best fallback alternative. And so we're not with the people who say we should ban 1080. For us, the bottom line is we've got to control the pests. If we can use other methods, we will. But if we have to use 1080 to control the pests, we'll do that.
Okay. And because I note there is a party that started up ban 1080, you've got Peter Salter standing in the West Coast Electorate. What do you think of all that activity? Yeah,
well, the party's founded by a guy in Golden Bay, which is part of the West Coast Tasman Electorate, called Bill Wallace, and I met him for the first time on Monday, actually. He seems a pretty reasonable guy. He's just passionate about that one issue. Peter Salter will be the candidate for West Coast Tasman, and he's the guy who runs the I think it's called the Bushman Centre or something at Pukekura, for anyone who knows.
Pies
So he's in trouble for serving possum pie, which seems to be ridiculous, although I'm vegetarian myself. So, these are both sincere, committed people who are actually wanting to control pests, but would rather we didn't do that with 1080. That's an area of common ground, but the difference lies in the fact that I would say that at this point in time anyway, that there are going to be areas that we can't control without 1080, and it's not an option to not control those areas.
So another big issue on the West Coast has been the collection of the wind-fallen trees. Nick Smith, he asserted that the benefits of collecting these naturally fallen trees outweighs the consideration of a few bugs and grubs. So what's your response to that?
I think what Nick Smith said in Parliament and has said outside Parliament too is disgraceful, actually. He's totally oversold the benefits of collecting those trees and completely minimised the costs. I mean, the fact is, what we're talking about here is the areas of land that have been set aside for conservation purposes. And in those areas of land, we believe that conservation values should be paramount. And the natural life cycle of a forest involves wind throw. And sometimes it involves large-scale wind throw, as has occurred in these areas of the West Coast. And what the ecological role of those fallen trees is that they provide the nutrients for the next generation of trees. And so if you've got a large-scale wind throw event, you've got a big area of the forest that needs new trees to grow up in. And so you need nutrients across a wide area of the forest. So that's why it's important ecologically to leave all of those trees where they are. His policy has been sold on the basis instead that it would be possible to remove some of those trees and not affect that ecological function. Well, that's not what the ecologists actually tell us. And what in fact will instead happen, I haven't talked about the private land because the wind throw didn't distinguish between conservation land and private land. So there is already private land with native forest on that was also subject to wind thrown timber. And there's nothing stopping the removal of those trees from that area. There is already an industry built around native timbers, and the problem that industry faces, and you'll have heard probably that differing voices from within that industry. Some certainly supporting the government's plan, but others saying, wait on a moment, we're actually struggling here already, and if you're suddenly going to be pulling a whole lot more timber out of the conservation estate now and putting it onto the market, there isn't suddenly a larger market for native timber-based products. So larger supply, same market equals lower price. Well, that lower price might drive some of the industry out of business, in fact. So oversold benefits and minimised costs.
But we have actually seen, because I think it's important to differentiate for people the difference here between your policy on cutting down trees that are growing quite healthily and from collecting fallen ones, because you are offering, it's a $1 million incentive for the first person to build a 10-storey building out of structural timber. So why can't that be built with windfallen trees?
Well, I mean, I've just talked to you about the reason why we don't want to pull those wind-thrown trees out of the conservation estate.
So it's because it's in the conservation estate?
Yeah, that's right. What we're saying is if you've got an area of land that's set aside for conservation purposes, then conservation values should be paramount. You know, you don't want to then compromise those areas. And that's important for conservation-wise, but it's also important economically, you know. So why do people go to the West Coast? You know, people like me who move to the West Coast, all of those health professionals I used to recruit to the West Coast, as well as all of the tourists who go there. So this is the backbone of the economy of the West Coast, go there because of the largely intact natural environments. When you start to compromise those natural environments, actually you put at risk not only the inherent values of those places, but also the economic future of the region. So this is incredible well, perhaps it's not incredible actually, it's typical short-sightedness of the national government.
Right. Okay, I'd like to move on now to when you called the government to account in 2012 over the high trust, low touch regulatory culture in New Zealand in reference to the Pike River coal mine.
Yes.
You addressed John Key in Parliament. Has anything changed since then?
Yes, it has. I mean, I feel really proud of the role that that the Green Party played in holding the government to account for what went wrong at Pike River. Certainly, we didn't achieve all of the things that we wanted to. So, for example, I believe that the Department of Labour should have been subject to prosecution for breaching the Occupational Health and Safety Act, as well as Peter Whittle, you know, so and actually the other senior management and board members of that company. So there's evaded accountability there. But what we did achieve, despite the government kind of blocking it for week after week after week in the House, our persistence resulted eventually in a review of the occupational health and safety regulatory framework with the legislation and the regulations themselves. And so what we've seen is a substantial overhaul of occupational health and safety regulation for underground coal mining, the systematic change to the whole of the law is partway through. You know, we've got a bill that hasn't been passed yet, but that's on its way too. And we've seen for underground coal mining as well a return to check inspectors, you know, which is inspectors appointed by the workers themselves to ensure safety in those mines. Now, the underlying tragedy is that it took 29 men dying in that particular disaster and some other disasters as well to achieve that change. The things that went wrong at Pike River are precisely the things that experienced coal miners back in the 1990s said would go wrong if the national government of the day, you know, Bill Birch and Max Bradford and that crew, did strip out the regulations and did do away with check inspectors. So they were proved right.
We had Helen Kelly on last week, and obviously she's the president of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, and she sees unions the way of the future of solving a lot of the safety issues in these areas. Do you feel that unions have a role to play here?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so it's very clear. If you look around the world at which countries and which industries have good health and safety records and which have poor health and safety records, there is a direct correlation to unionisation of the workforce. So unionisation is correlated with much safer workplaces. And it's kind of obvious why that would be, because unions actually prevent management and ownership of big companies that otherwise would have, you know, an unfettered interest in pursuing profit at the expense of health and safety or other worker conditions are less able to do that in a unionised workplace. So it's very clearly in the interest of not only the financial interests of workers, but actually their direct physical and mental interests to actually be involved in unions.
And there are concerns from people who may want to join a union over job security, the risk of doing so. Employers don't like it. If you were to get into government, what will you do in this area?
Well, I mean, the first thing that we'll do is trash the bill that would have been passed by this government were it not for the fact that John Banks left Parliament. That would have further undermined collective bargaining and sort of further undermined the role of unions in the New Zealand workforce, and would have done away with standard rest breaks for workers, actually sort of taking us back really pretty much to the 19th century, pre-1908 industrial relations. If National gets to form the next government, they will pass that law. If we get to be part of the next government, we will turf that out straight away, as well as reversing other changes that the government made. So the 90-day fire at will bill, for example, will be gone. Youth rates gone. And a whole lot of other changes that this government has made.
And so looking at workplace rights, I suppose, we look at workplace equality. Females are still not paid equally with their male counterparts. In fact, it seems we're actually stagnating here in terms of advances. So what's the solution?
Well, I mean, I think so my colleague Jan Logie had a bill to address this. I think that there's a bunch of things that could be done. So requiring decent reporting, for example, on the performance of individual workplaces. That's one of the things that could be done. If that fails to actually move things forward, then we need to, I guess, legislate. Jan's probably the expert rather than me. I guess what I would reflect on is the health sector, which is the area that I know the best. And what we're still seeing there is that occupations within the health sector that I guess female dominated are systematically paid less than occupations that are male dominated. And I think that a sector like that, which is largely the state sector, we ought to be able to intervene much more directly as a government. These are government employees to ensure that there is pay parity.
Yeah, and the health sector is something that's going to affect us all at some point. And have we got anything on Twitter about health?
Oh yes. We've received a Twitter question from Aaron Hawkins. If prevention is more effective than cure, why have successive governments not addressed this in health spending? How can we?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the simple reason is that we've had a succession of governments who've been focused on 3-year horizons. And so what they have focused on is kind of measures of system performance that are easily counted. So Tony Ryle has been a classic example of that. So his answer to pretty well every question you ever ask about health is, well, there's more elective surgery. And elective surgery is something that's easy to count. How many operations are you doing? How long are people waiting for operations? What isn't easy to count is how many people did you stop from getting type 2 diabetes? So it's a longer lead time, and it's kind of harder to be absolutely sure that it was your intervention that stopped it rather than something else. And what someone like Tony Ryle knows is that that means that you can safely pull money out of that area of diabetes prevention, and people won't notice. They won't notice until another 5 or 10 years' time when actually our type 2 diabetes rates are escalating as they're projected to.
So how do we prevent type 2 diabetes?
Oh, well, it's largely obesity prevention, of course. You know, so we have treatment costs for type 2 diabetes that are projected to quadruple between now and 2021. So over the next 7 years, from $500 million a year now to $2 billion a year in 2021. Now that is a catastrophic impact. And yet, Tony Ryle has taken money out of obesity prevention programs. You know, he roughly halved the amount of money going into illness prevention programs in general, and specifically pulled it out of obesity prevention stuff. He's put a little bit back in this year's budget, but not nearly enough to be getting ahead of that curve of increasing cost. And, you know, lest people think I'm just interested in the cost. Of course, that cost represents a whole amount of disability and suffering and pain for many New Zealanders, which we could avoid.
Okay, so how can we avoid it?
Well, so what the basic thing we need to do is we need to ensure, first of all, that health spending keeps pace with increasing need. You know, with every year there are more people. We're on average older. We face a more complex pattern of chronic conditions like type 2 diabetes. And while that's been increasing steeply, funding for health services has been on a much lower path of increase. So it has been increasing, but not enough to tread water against that pattern of increasing need. So the first thing we need to do is ensure that we do keep pace. Second thing is we need to shift the point of investment so that we actually move some of the investment out of the more highly specialised services. And I think Gareth Morgan's book is quite interesting about that, where he notes that in the very final period of life, you know, final week of life, day of life, we spend an enormous amount of money on someone who is mostly saying, please don't. So actually, if we didn't do that, for example, and that's just one area where we could take some money out and put it into the other end, where we actually prevent illness and keep people well in the first place, because we know that that's, you know, on average 4 times as cost effective as more specialised services.
So is that almost, would you support euthanasia?
I'm not talking about that. What I'm saying is, at the end of life, so if you look at a curve of health spending against years of life, there's increased amount in very early in life when we're small children, and then it mostly is a pretty low level through most of our lives, apart from women at sort of childbearing age, where there's sort of I was going to say a bump, but not that kind of bump. And then as we get older, it increases again. And the most expensive year is our last year of life. The most expensive day is our last day of life. And for the most part, a person who is kind of laying, you know, dying, or you know, in a hospital, is not saying, please do whatever you can to extend my life by a bit more. They're saying, can you please let me go, actually, is my experience of what's usually happening. So we've got a mismatch between patients' expectations or wishes and what the system is designed to do. That started to shift a bit over the past few years, but I think having a mature conversation with New Zealanders about that could actually make quite a significant difference, both in terms of their quality of dying, and so I'm talking about great palliative care services, but also in terms of freeing up resources that actually could achieve a whole lot of health gain earlier in life.
And you supported putting the fluoride in water for all New Zealanders, is that correct?
I'm personally a big fan of water fluoridation. I've been strongly associated with it over the years.
So why has that bid not been successful, do you think?
Well, it has been. You know, sort of probably half of New Zealand communities have fluoridated water supplies. I think, I mean, my own observation is that the New Zealand community is, has widely divergent views on the issue. I think when I say we, I'm talking about the science community generally, has struggled to communicate what is good evidence and what is not good evidence, and as a result, a lot of communities are pretty confused about what the evidence is. So I think science community needs to do a better job, but I also think it's arguable, and this is a personal view, that district councils, who actually don't have health expertise or the expertise to interpret the epidemiological science, probably aren't the right people to make that decision. The Health Select Committee this year proposed that perhaps district health boards could actually take on that role, because they have that sort of local democracy character that I know a lot of people would value, but they also have direct access to the technical and scientific expertise to be able to interpret the evidence, and all of the arguments that people make are health-based arguments. And I note that local government themselves, so Local Government New Zealand has been, has said, perhaps we're not the right people to be making these decisions.
So in real terms, for your average person, Green Party get into government, what are you going to implement in terms of health that they're going to see on a daily basis? So are you going to tax sugar?
Well, yeah. So we're going to tax sugar-sweetened drinks, or put a levy on sugar-sweetened drinks. And we're prepared to look at the use of levies or taxes to control prices, or to adjust prices on other products as well. If you look at what's happened with tobacco-related disease, so for many years tobacco was the #1 cause of preventable illness and death in New Zealand. But actually that's trending downwards really satisfactorily. So why is it trending downwards? It's not trending downwards because we're getting better at telling people that smoking causes lung cancer. It's trending downwards because we're prepared to use price. We've adjusted where you can smoke, where you can buy tobacco-related products, so availability, and we've stopped marketing. Those are the things. Controlling the environment that drives health status actually is the way to adjust this. But what this government has said in relation to obesity-related disease, like type 2 diabetes and heart disease and cancers, arthritis, is no, we're going to give people good information about healthy foods. It would be wrong of us, it would be nanny state to use any of those methods that we know from the evidence actually work. So we wouldn't be scared to actually use what works, and that is adjusting the food environment. So yes, price, sugar-sweetened beverages first of all, and then if we can construct a tax that'll work on other products to actually change behaviour, we should. And price, the thing about a levy, right, is if you increase the price of something, you will drive down consumption. So you reduce consumption, so you get a direct health effect there. The second thing that happens is the manufacturer of that product, that food product or drink, then has a real incentive to change the formulation of the product to actually make it healthy enough to escape the levy or minimise the levy, which is great too. And then the third thing is you're creating this big pool of revenue that you can then use to fund some of those public health programs, those illness prevention programs I was talking about before. So price, availability, one of the first things the Nats did was repeal the requirement for schools to only sell healthy food. Well, why on earth would you do that? So if we're interested in our kids' health, we are, then we actually want to ensure that schools are healthy places, that hospitals are healthy places, for example. Marketing, we still have advertising of essentially junk food, unhealthy foods to kids. We've got the, let's say, a big brand restaurant that sponsors kids' soccer on Saturday mornings. Well, we don't, if you take a look at a soccer stadium from the 1970s, you will be amazed at all of the tobacco sponsorship around that stadium, which looks totally incongruous and out of place now. I would like to think that in 20 years' time, the sports stadium of the future will not have any of that junk food or alcohol advertising that it's got now.
So are we going to also see a tax on junk food coming in from you for fast food?
What we're saying is, so one of the issues is, when you get into foods rather than drinks, so sugary drinks is kind of a relatively straightforward case because there's no redeeming features, and you're not going to displace consumption onto something equally as unhealthy or unhealthier. Foods are a bit more tricky because you've got, sugar, you've got saturated fat, you've got salt, and so constructing, a tax in a way that doesn't just displace consumption onto something that's equally as unhealthy is a trickier proposition. So what we've said is we'll look at that. We'll ask experts to have a look at seeing how you could construct one, and then we'll talk to the New Zealand public about that.
And if we're going to lead the New Zealand public by their pocket, will we see incentives to make healthier choices, perhaps a GST off of fruit and veg? Are you looking into any of those initiatives?
There was a really interesting study that gave consumers, I think it was a kind of a card that made in the supermarket unhealthier sort of food options more expensive, and then used that extra money as providing an incentive on the healthier products that people bought. So I think it's worth having a look at that. In general, so we have not supported the GST off fruit and veg. We took a really close look at that last election when Labour was proposing it, and we came to the conclusion that, first of all, it would be really, there would be a whole lot of issues around boundaries, defining what was in the category or outside the category. Secondly, GST does have some strengths as a sort of simple tax that hasn't got a whole lot of exceptions on it, and you wouldn't move away from that without a really strong reason. Thirdly, unless you're also going to introduce 1970s style price control, the main effect of taking GST off fruit and veg would be to increase the margins of supermarkets rather than actually making those products cheaper for consumers. And so we favoured instead the other approach of focusing on incomes. And so that's why the Green Party's got a really strong policy around reducing costs and increasing the incomes of the lowest income New Zealanders, so that they're in a stronger position to be able to afford healthy food.
Okay, so something that we can control is cannabis. In 2011 on Vote Chat you said that you were pro-legalisation. Has that stance changed?
No.
No? So the party line is now decriminalisation?
No, well, we don't use either of those words, in fact, in our policy. So what we say is that there should be no penalty for possession and use by people over the age of 18, but under our policy, cultivation and sale, commercial cultivation and sale would remain illegal. So I don't know whether you call that decriminalisation or legalisation. I personally don't find them to be terribly useful terms. In the bigger scale of things, and of course on the issue of medicinal cannabis, that we've been very active in advancing that as a cause. We think that it's a compelling case, and as television recently has shown, we're not the only ones who think that. More broadly, what we're saying is that our drug laws are hopelessly obsolete, and inconsistent. And what we've been arguing for is for there to be a consistent framework that's used for regulating all drugs. So first of all, a switch from kind of a justice-based approach to regulation to a health-based approach to regulation. So focusing on what are the health risks associated with this particular drug? How do we best minimise those risks, minimise the harm associated with that drug? So a consistent framework that applies regulation in proportion to the risk that each drug poses with the aim of minimising. So Green Party policy is, it's best to be drug-free. But actually, not many of us accomplish that. So given that people are going to use drugs, and I include alcohol, of course, in this, as well as cannabis and other illegal drugs. Because people are going to use them, our focus should not be on actually a failed approach. So you think about cannabis. Most adult New Zealanders have used cannabis. Having it illegal has failed to curb demand.
Why not tax it then? Why not make it fully legal and collect on that?
Yeah. Well, it may well be that we move in that direction, and clearly Colorado's done that. But you take Uruguay, for example, that's used a different approach. I think we're at a point now where there's such a lot happening in the international space that any responsible government would be wanting to look at what's happening in those jurisdictions and say, well, what's working, what isn't working, and then compare that to our own jurisdiction to say, okay, what can we learn from that? So Colorado, for example, they're certainly gaining revenue from the tax. They're also reporting reduced crime rates. It's probably too early to know whether that's a durable result of their jurisdiction and whether it can be proved to be associated with their cannabis law reform. It seems to be at this point. And that kind of makes sense because, I mean, you'll know, not sort of personal aspersion, but New Zealanders will know that that because of the illicit nature of all drugs apart from tobacco and alcohol, if people want to acquire those, they very frequently come into contact with the criminal world. And so the law as it currently stands forces people into contact with criminality that they wouldn't otherwise have.
So moving now towards the election,
Yep.
We've got Internet Mana around at the moment. Yes, so it's looking very likely they're going to get a few seats. Are you comfortable going to a coalition with them?
Well, I mean, so we're very, very focused on our own party and our own interests. So rather than spending energy and resource sort of thinking about or talking about other
Certainly,
other
but do you see
parties.
them having value?
Well, I mean, we've over the years worked pretty closely with Hone. You know, sort of since he formed the Mana Party, and you know, we cast his vote when he's not available in the House, and we usually vote the same way. So clearly we can see some commonality there. He's someone we have respect and trust in. Internet Party is so much newer, and I guess what I'd say is we don't, while we know some of the people involved in it, it's a new party that does not have a track record, and so harder to know how that's going to work. Certainly they seem to have a lot of policy commonality with the Green Party. I guess we should be pleased about that, because if they do end up in a government with us, and we're not ruling anyone in or out, we just don't think that's a very helpful way of going about it. There should be some possibility of some gains. And
so, coming into this election, what is it that you're hoping to gain? What's your ideal outcome?
Well, we need to change the government, of course, and people need to understand that they need to vote Green with their party vote if they not only want a new government, but they also want a new direction. You know, one that actually provides a New Zealand that is for a cleaner environment, a fairer society, and a smarter economy that helps us deliver on those things. So we need to be a really substantial part of the next government. It's no secret that we're saying that we're targeting at least 15% of the party vote. That would be an increase from just over 11% last time. And that would bring us more than 20 MPs. And at that size, we're saying we would want cabinet posts and policy gains in proportion to our size in a government.
All right, so we are out of time, so that's a 15% the Greens would like.
And more.
And more, potentially, but you do only have one vote each, so... If you'd like to cast your tick for Kevin, I'm sure he'd be delighted. Thank you for coming on the show. That does bring us to the end of today's show. A reminder to those of you not yet enrolled to vote, Google it, do it. I'd like to thank our researchers, Paul and Hannah, for their contributions to today's show, and as always, the University of Otago's Politics and Communications departments for their ongoing support. Please join us here next week at the usual time of 1 p.m, when we'll have Labour MP David Clark on the show. My name's Nicole Taber, and I thank you for watching Vote Chat.